Hey there, it's Kate Swoboda, also known as Kate Courageous. I'm the creator of YourCourageousLife.com, the director of the Courageous Living Coach certification at TeamCLCC.com, and author of the book, The Courage Habit. In my continuing quest as a multi-potentialite, I also talk about teaching the teachers over at Facilitate with Impact. And now I'm the host of a new podcast, the Your Courageous Life podcast. We're going to talk about going after what you want and living a more courageous, emotionally resilient life. I might drop a couple of F-bombs, so don't listen with your kids in the back seat. And here we go. Hey everybody, love having you here and love doing this. Good morning, good morning. It's a morning for me. It might not be for you, but it is for me. I wanted to talk today about what I think it takes to really change, to truly change. I wanted to talk about this because isn't that at the heart of basically everything that every life coach is really trying to do with a client? The client comes and they say, I really want to change something about my life. And often the client initially arrives with like a top level change. I want a different job. I want to get back into dating and find a great relationship. I want to stop feeling so overwhelmed. I want to get my schedule organized. And there are all these great, wonderful things that people want. And in my mind, what the best coaches do, and what I endeavor to train everybody who participates in the Courageous Living Coach certification, which is the coach training program that I run, what I'm trying to train all of those coaches to do is to hold that vision of that top level, usually more strategic, usually more problem-centered concern, and then distill down into the person. I've heard people phrase it as coaching the person, not the problem. I think of it as really bringing a holistic view to coaching. And whatever it is that somebody's going to change on the top level, they're going to need to change internally. So as I think about what it takes to really change, what I've observed more than 10 years of working with clients now, ain't my first time at the rodeo. Here's what I notice. And I'm hoping that as you're listening along, you're going, all right, these are the things I need to integrate too. Before I hit record today, I really just sat and breathed with that question. How is it that we really change our lives? What really goes into changing our lives? And I grabbed a little slip of paper next to my desk. My desk is perpetually a mess. Speaking of things that I'd like to have on my change list, an organized desk would be one of those things. And I jotted down a couple of things, and I thought I'd read what I jotted down first, and then I'd go into some of these just a little bit. First one I jotted down, how do you really change your life? Know your patterns and unhook from the stories. Then deep compassion for your process and for yourself. They are two different things. Your process is not you, it's your process. And you at your core, and having compassion for that, is you at your core. The process is what you do. You is who you are. Forgive who you were. A lot of people end up not changing because they have trouble forgiving who they were, facing the regret. Be real about what you feel. Purge it. Get it out, up and out. And be clear on boundaries, your own, for yourself, and with others. So I'll talk about what each of those mean. And I don't know about you, but I'm like a huge note taker when I'm listening to a podcast. I feel like taking notes is part of how I process. It's part of the reason my desk is a mess, because I have slips of paper everywhere, even taped on the wall above my desk. And I like them until it gets to like hoarder level, and it's just like, all right, I gotta start purging some paper here. I recycle all of it. But I would suggest grabbing a little slip of paper maybe something that you want to write in a journal, and just think about some of these and think about ways in which you notice that you resonate with some of these. Here we go. All right, first one. Know your patterns and unhook from the stories. I talk about this a lot in the Courage Habit. People asked me about this when I was on book tour for the Courage Habit. Here's the deal. If you don't know what you're already doing, what your pattern is, and especially I think where it's become a habit, you will just keep repeating it and getting sucked into it. And sometimes people come to work with a coach and they go, I'm tired of therapy. I'm tired of talking about my past. I feel like coaching is going to be talking about my future. That's why I want to switch to coaching. And whenever I hear that, I get it on some level, but then I also can't help but wonder, does the person who's been working with a therapist, have they really fully understood their past? I think therapeutic modalities that look at your past and why your patterns have been what they've been can be enormously helpful. Because if we don't understand why we've been doing what we've been doing, if we don't know that the reason that we've been chasing perfectionism is because of love that we didn't feel we got when we were a kid, and we're just subconsciously always searching for that love, well, you can try to drop the perfectionism, but man, I've seen people, myself included, go completely the opposite direction, and then they start trying to like somehow be perfect at not being perfect, if that makes any sense. So you got to know your patterns and you got to unhook from the stories. And in the Courage Habit, I talk about 4 predominant fear routines, because when patterns, habits are habitual, they run on that habit-based cue, routine, reward loop. There's actually a loop in the brain. This was so cool to me to learn. There's a loop in the brain that your habits run on. It's controlled predominantly by a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. And there's a cue, which is like you're thinking, all right, I'm going to go after something that I deeply desire. I'm going to embrace my most courageous self. Here's what that's going to look like. And you get excited, but then you feel fear. And when you feel afraid, you go into a routine. And there are 4 predominant routines or patterns, and they are perfectionism, people-pleasing or martyrdom, pessimism, and self-sabotage. And we go into those patterns because we're going after the reward. And you might be thinking, like, pessimism is a route to a reward? Yeah, it is in the moment. Because if you're going after a big dream and you want to change your life, and you go into pessimism, and pessimism tells you, what's the point? Then you might back down on going after that big dream. And in the short term, not in the long term, but in the short term, you feel less intimidated. You no longer have all that work, all that potential for rejection, all that stuff on your plate that you might be doing in service to your dream. So perfectionism, martyrdom, I also call it people-pleasing, pessimism, and self-sabotage. Perfectionism, martyrdom, pessimism, self-sabotage. We all do all of these at least a little bit. Usually one of them hooks us more than the rest. And I'm raising my hand right here for definitely for perfectionism. And I noticed that my pattern is to like go full bore perfectionism. And then when that becomes totally exhausting, to then go into pessimism. Like, oh, I worked so hard. What's the point? It didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen, And knowing that pattern is crucial. It's so crucial. How can I possibly shift anything in my life, especially with a pattern like perfectionism, if I don't understand that that's what I do? I mean, I don't know. It seems like it would take a very specific kind of brain to be able to just very logically and reasonably go, oh, well, that I haven't been happy doing it the way I've been doing it. Flip the switch. Now I'll do it differently. There we go. Like, no. These patterns, perfectionism, martyrdom, pessimism, self-sabotage, they have worn a groove in our brain. And we need to understand the groove in order to change it, in order to create a new groove. That's the first part of this. So then we're getting into unhooking from the stories, because with any routine, there are certain capital S stories that go with that routine. So if you're a perfectionist, one of the stories is probably going to be either I'm not enough or I'm supposed to be perfect. And it's this story, this assumption. Stories are assumptions that we make. They feel so real. And if you aren't aware of your pattern and aware of the corresponding story, it's really hard to unhook from that. It's really hard to create a new habit. So you got to know your patterns, you got to unhook from the stories. Tons of resources out there, by the way, for learning about what your patterns are. I know that you're probably already aware of some of my own, The Courage Habit, the book that you can actually buy, booksellers everywhere. It's on Amazon, but totally for free if you join the Your Courageous Life list, yourcourageouslife.com/begin. You will get access to a library of resources that I update continually. And one of the things in that library is a bunch of worksheets that are intended to be used with the Courage Habit book, which is super cool. So you want some of those freebies, head on over there. You can get them delivered conveniently to your inbox. All right, so now let's talk about another thing that I jotted down. Deep compassion for the process and for yourself. And I already mentioned that the process and you are different. And now that probably makes a little more sense because I outlined some fear routines people go into. So, for instance, perfectionism, that's part of my process, for better or for worse. It's not who I am, it's the process that I tend to go into the most. So I need to have compassion for who I am at my core, for the fact that I'm a flawed human being, for the fact that geez Louise, even though I've seen a gazillion times that perfectionism is not where it's at, I still get tripped up sometimes. Usually when I'm in a space of fear, and definitely when I am not bringing my conscious awareness to what I want and my intuition and to my wisest self. So who I am is different than the process that I happen to be in. And I think it's helpful to unhook from those because I think we need to defuse from the things we do sometimes. I think sometimes even our culture gets this really dangerous almost assumption that a snapshot of what someone does in a moment or a season or a phase of their life is all of who they are. And I think we'd all have a lot more compassion for one another, and the world needs more compassion if we'd start going, okay, like if somebody's been doing something that's not in their best interest for years, all right, we'll go ahead and we'll say that's part of who this person is. I'm willing to go there. But if someone is behaving a certain way in a season of their life, maybe it's just who they are for that season. At least that's the way that I try to have some compassion for myself. I try to really look at how we do the best we can with the tools that we feel we have available to us. And so if you are a pessimist and that is how you make it through the day when you're disappointed, that's the tool you are accustomed to using. And you need some compassion for the fact that you, as a failing, flailing, imperfect, wonderful, brilliant, glorious human being, the whole mixed bag, just like all of us, that pessimism is a tool you use. It might not be a very effective tool, right? But pessimism is a tool that you use, or self-sabotage is a tool that you use, or martyrdom or perfectionism is a tool that you habitually use to decrease stress. You need some different tools. Yes, we'll get to that in a moment. But in the meantime, how about some deep compassion for the fact that you are a human being doing the best you can with the tools that you have felt able to use? Doesn't mean that an amends won't need to be made at some point. Doesn't mean that self-responsibility isn't there. Doesn't mean that we all just kind of hold hands and sing together and go, it's okay, it's fine. Like, there's some very real damage that we can sometimes cause with our fear routines. But will you take a moment to have some deep compassion for who you are as a flailing, failing, wonderful, glorious human being? And will you take a moment to have some compassion for the fact that you've been in a process? And whatever process it is, as imperfect as it is, the process is not who you are. It's just a process you've been engaging in. All right, forgiving who you were. To forgive who you were is part of moving on. And I think that when you know your patterns and you unhook from the stories and you start to have deep compassion for yourself, this becomes another place where people get tripped up. They don't want to forgive who they were. And it's not, well, let me back up. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't know how, because in our culture, we think of forgiveness as a one-stop shop. We think, yes, I need to forgive myself. I'd better do that. Then they look at all the shame. We look at all our shame. We look at all our stuff. And then it feels awful. And then we get pulled right back into being hooked in, oh my God, I'm so awful. How could I have done these things? Why did I waste so much time? I mistreated that person. I never did this thing that I should have done when I was younger. Now I'm too old, or whatever the things are that we tell ourselves about why we should have been doing it better in the past by now, or we should have learned by now. So we got to forgive who we are. We got to stop thinking of forgiveness as a destination point or as a moment when the heavens open up and you are forgiven because the light shines down on you. I don't think it works that way. It doesn't work that way for me. The worst that I ever was in my pattern of perfectionism, I was a complete bitch to be around. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I can still be there. But the worst that I ever was in perfectionism, like the hardest shadow, was just being a completely abusive bitch. Basically, all the stuff that I had in my head that I told myself, get your shit together. Come on. You can do better than that. You know, like that voice. Oh, God. It's giving me the shivers to even hear that voice in my head. I had so much shame about that voice. I never wanted anyone to know that that voice existed. And you know, the only person who did really, really know that that voice existed? My husband. Like, the man I love more than anybody in the whole wide world. My husband. Like, it was brutal for him. It was brutal for me, but it was brutal for him. And the shame that I carried, I mean, I would wake up in the morning and I'd go, okay, today I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to snipe at him. I'm not going to nitpick. I'm not going to, and then I'd do it. And then I'd be thrown back into this whole thing. You know, you can hear the perfectionism at work, by the way. Thrown back into this whole thing of how could I be such a total bitch to this guy who I love? I know I love this guy. I know he loves me. And I know he doesn't deserve any of what I'm doing here. And the forgiveness that I most needed was that forgiveness. I mean, it felt wrong to forgive myself on some level. How could I be going around trying to give compassion and forgiveness to myself when I'm the asshole and he's the one who's the victim of me being so awful? That was the other hook I was in for a long time. And again, got a pepper with disclaimers, still can get into. But I've got a lot of stuff set up in my life right now that makes it easier not to go into those patterns. So what do you do if you know you want to forgive yourself, but it's bringing up so much shame to forgive who you were? You know, people who are stuck in a martyrdom pattern often have trouble forgiving themselves for the ways that they didn't prioritize their own dreams. Or they have trouble like really releasing and feeling like they're good people if they stop caretaking for everybody else. People who have been engaging in a lot of pessimism and self-sabotage tend to have trouble forgiving themselves for what they perceive as the lost time. Like, I lost all that time. How could I have done that to my life? So whatever it is from the past that you feel like you're having some trouble letting go of, if you recognize yourself in what I describe, where you go, okay, I want to forgive myself, I want to have compassion for myself, and then suddenly you're thrown into all the crap that you did wrong. Part of changing is going to be accepting that forgiveness is not a one-stop shop. You are going to feel like you can forgive yourself on a Monday, and then feel like you are a piece of crap on a Tuesday, and then take your deep breath and access the body and listen without attachment to the stories that you tell and go, okay, this is part of my pattern. Because, of course, what keeps you stuck in the pattern? Not forgiving yourself. So not forgiving yourself is part of the pattern. If we're starting with know your patterns and unhook from the stories, then guess what? You got to know that not forgiving yourself is part of the pattern. And you got to go, okay, if I'm going to break the pattern, I got to have some deep compassion for my process and for myself and being a flailing, failing, wonderful, glorious human being. So you're going to feel like you can do that on a Monday, and you're going to feel like you're crap again on a Tuesday, and then Tuesday afternoon you're going to feel better, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday you're going to be tossing and turning it again, and then Friday afternoon you're going to be like, okay, you know what, I just need a break from thinking about this all weekend long. And then maybe all weekend you'll numb out and not think about any of it or be present to any of it. And then Monday you'll go, okay, I'm willing to try again. That's how this goes. That's actually how this goes. And you'll go in waves too, and you'll think, okay, I've completely and totally forgiven myself for that. You'll feel really good for a while. And then you'll notice that some little tiny thing feels like a little wiggle of, I don't know that I'm totally over that. I mean, I felt it just now, disclosing on a freaking podcast that I have been, in my past, a total jerk to my husband. A little bit of like, oh, how could you have been that way? And it's like, how I could have been that way is because I was in pain. Because the only tool I had at that time was perfectionism, and it was a heavy hammer. I was hitting myself with that hammer. I was hitting him with that hammer. And, more perfectionism and trying to do it better never worked. I tried that for a long time. But what did work was getting vulnerable and going, okay, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what the hell I'm doing here. So the pattern has control over me. So I need to look at every single place where the pattern has become a habit. I need to be present. I need to be conscious. I need to look at it, and it all starts swirling together. Know your patterns, unhook from the stories, deep compassion, forgive who you were, and let it take time. And on that note, be real about what you feel. Purge. I have gone on record on a number of podcasts at this point about this process that I engage with called conscious crying. And in the courage habit, the first part of the courage habit process that I talk about is accessing the body. The whole courage habit process, which, yes, I engage with regularly. And yes, you can make these behaviors your new habits instead of the perfectionism and martyrdom and pessimism and self-sabotage. The whole courage habit process is access the body, listen without attachment, reframe limiting stories, reach out, and create community. Accessing the body is part of being real about what you feel, purging the excess. So if you imagine that in your body, it's like you've got this emotional balloon and it's getting so full. It's getting so full because there's the Trump administration and so many things coming out that you didn't even know. Like just recently, all the news stories, recently as of me recording this, all the news stories about children whose parents have been deported or they've been separated from their immigrant parents and put in detention centers, and everybody's going, oh my God, it's the Trump administration. And then suddenly other people are going, hey, you guys, I got to tell you something. This was happening under the Obama administration too. So it's not about any one administration and really going at it with them, it's about going, oh my God, all this corruption, this is heartbreaking. And sexual harassment and assault and people starving and global collapse of beehives and fisheries and plastic swimming around the size of Texas in the ocean. And on top of all that, there's maybe you don't feel like you're enough in your life, or maybe you hate your job, or maybe you're having trouble paying your bills, or maybe your kid is special needs, and that's super scary and stressful for you to try to figure out, like, how do I really give my kid everything that he or she deserves and needs? And how do I fill my own cup? And maybe on top of that, you've got a friend who's mad at you, and oh, all the tension, all the stress, right? So imagine that emotional balloon, and it fills with air, and it fills with air, and it fills with air. And what does a balloon do when it fills with enough air? It either leaks or it explodes. And leaking your emotional self would probably look like those little passive-aggressive Facebook comments or tech support requests that are less than kind. I always feel like I just want to offer up an apology now to anyone I've ever sent a tech support request to when I was seriously pissed off, because I have not always been a kind person in that regard. Or there's exploding, which is really just going off on the people around you. And so we need to vent that emotional balloon. And this metaphor, by the way, I learned from the Challenge Day organization, challengeday.org. Check them out. They're amazing. They have a lot of programs to try to help bullying in schools, but they also have programs for adults. I highly recommend their work. And for me, being real about what you feel is accessing the body and doing a lot of what I call conscious crying. So in the same way that you sit down and you might meditate in a corner of your office and look at the wall and breathe in and breathe out and let your whole nervous system relax, and then a timer goes off, and then you're like, okay, I've put in my 20 minutes. I do something just like that, only for crying and being pissed. And it looks a little bit like this. Again, timer, awesome. Only my timer is in the form of a playlist. I have assembled a couple playlists that are like the most intense, angry, grrr kind of music, and others that are like really sad songs, the ones that always make you cry. And I put on one of those lists. I've got a box of tissues. I've got a towel. I sit over in the same corner where I would meditate. I have a little corner in my office with an altar. And I put on this playlist. Usually it's the sad one. That's the more vulnerable emotion. And I sit down and I think about all the stuff. I go ahead and I'm just like, okay, I want this up and out. All right, I want it up and out of me. So I'm going to go ahead and pull in. This is my space to think about it, to cry the tears that need to be shed about children that are separated from their parents, about my fear, my terror. I have a little girl. My fear, my terror that she could go to school one day and get shot. What kind of fucking world are we living in right now? You get the picture. So I get real about all of that. And I get real about the tears I didn't cry that time when I was 10 years old and was hurt by the mean girls at school. Or maybe I'll think about how angry I am at myself that I treated my husband how I did, or that I treated anybody else how I did. Maybe I'll think about places where I'm afraid of failing. Like afraid of failing as in I haven't failed yet, but I'm just afraid of it. So I'm thinking about that stuff. And I just go ahead and I cry. Cry it out. Or scream it out if anger feels like the more prevalent emotion. Nobody's home whenever I do this. We have double paned windows. And it's something I consider to be very private and very personal. And when I do this, at the end, it feels like I'm cleaned out. Like, okay, here I am. I have arrived at clear thinking. venting out my emotions is like scraping off that layer so that then I can go, all right, what senator or representative do I need to call? What's the email I need to write? What's the awareness I need to share? What boots on the ground are needed? Or maybe it's going to be, I need to make an amends. I need to just say to someone, hey, I love you. I'm really sorry that we're having this conflict right now. I actually do want to do it better. Do you think we could create some room to do it better? So it's really about going, okay, you know what? Nobody does this life thing perfectly, least of all me. How do we get some of these emotions up and out? And this again ties in with everything. It's like you're frustrated with yourself or having a difficult time having compassion for yourself, having a hard time forgiving who you are. Take some time to cry about it. And with this practice, I got to tell you, you like you really got to do it initially like 7 days in a row to really get to the core of the gunk and start feeling like, oh my God, I am so much more joyful in every other area of my life. But it's for real and it's so, so good. So be real about what you feel. Purge it. Get it up and out so that it doesn't control you. All right, so know your patterns and unhook from the stories. Deep compassion for the process and yourself. Forgive who you were. Be real about what you feel. Purge it up and out. And be clear on boundaries, your own and with others. You might be thinking, what do you mean? Aren't they one and the same? No, they're not. Here's how they're different. So your boundaries with others are about the shit that other people throw at you that you will or will not allow into your life. So if you have a pattern like self-sabotage, you need to know who those friends are who are always up for a good time instead of getting the stuff they need to get done, because they're probably going to trigger your old pattern of self-sabotage. You're responsible for yourself, don't get me wrong. That's on you if you don't stick to what it is that you really want and get conscious about your habits and then interrupt them. But boundaries with other people are important to look at. People pleasing, martyrdom. Those people who guilt you, who always seem to, a classic narcissist can sniff out a people pleaser at 50 paces, I'd like to think. Those people who always seem to tripwire you into doing stuff for them and not prioritizing yourself. Again, this is your pattern, not theirs. You're responsible for shifting your pattern, and they are not responsible for shifting you. But it's probably a good idea to be aware of how they tripwire your pattern so that you can interrupt it. So your boundaries are your business. And in the Courage Habit, I actually talk about dealing with difficult people, because when people start to change, one of the first things that happens is the people around them notice and react. And often the people who are most afraid of changing their own lives don't like it. Think about it for a minute. We've probably all been this person before. If you're intimidated about going after your own dreams, it feels really, really difficult to watch someone else rocking out, changing their life. There might be a little part of you that's going, why am I not changing mine? Now, if you're conscious of the fact that that's how you're reacting to somebody else, aces, because that's how you can then put the attention back on you. But a lot of people are not conscious of that reaction, and then they start getting frustrated, or then they start putting things on somebody else, and on and on and on. You know what I'm talking about. So boundaries with others are about really going, okay, I have got to get conscious and intentional about what I will and won't allow in my life. This does not mean that you do a carte blanche cutting off from everybody else in your life. Okay? I'm not saying you have to ditch everybody in your life. I'm saying you have to be aware of how your pattern does a dance with their pattern. And there might be some people where you need to say, yeah, I'm done here. This doesn't work for me. But for the most part, what I encourage, rather than some big dramatic, I'm not going to be your friend anymore, is for you to keep your side of the street clean. And this is something I learned from my coach, Matthew Marzell. his big thing, if you tried to come into a session with him and talk about how they done did you wrong, he'd be like, nope, you are responsible for your side of the street. And that includes, by the way, with people who are seriously dysfunctional. Your side of the street might be, I need to not engage with this person. But again, before you make that kind of a decision, it's a good idea to keep coming back to, is my side of the street clean? Which puts us right back into, be clear on boundaries, your own. I said be clear on boundaries, your own and with others. They're not one and the same. Boundaries with others are about them, but your own boundaries with yourself. What do you tolerate in your life right now that is just complete bullshit that you tolerate? Really sit with that question. Like, what do you tolerate in your life right now that is just complete bullshit that you tolerate? Like, do you tolerate putting junk in your body? Do you tolerate putting food in your body that you know doesn't actually really give you nutrition? Really think about that. Do you tolerate telling yourself inside your head that you're crap? Do you tolerate someone speaking to you in a way that is totally disrespectful? Do you tolerate wasting your time? I mean, do you have big dreams, things that you want to do, ways of being that you want to shift? Or maybe it's just as simple as, I'm not as happy as I'd like to be. Do you tolerate sitting in front of Netflix night after night after night? Or Facebook? Or somewhere else? Do you tolerate inactivity? I mean, how much research needs to come out that you need to move your body at least a little bit every day? I'm not talking about like becoming some, super ripped weightlifter. I'm talking about like you need to be doing 30 to 60 minutes of moving your body every day. That's just a fact. It's just a fact of being human. In some way, as often as you are able, moving your body is good for you. So do you tolerate a lot of sitting, a lot of copping out on exercise, a lot of choices? Do you tolerate a lot of choices that actually have you living a lower quality of life? Do you tolerate a lower quality of health? So this is where being clear on boundaries, your own boundaries, is important. And there are a couple ways that in my life I look at what I tolerate. And one of the most important metrics for me is, do I feel proud of myself with this choice? Because integrity can vary a little bit from person to person, but there's a baseline level of integrity where like the truth is that you know whether or not you're in integrity with yourself. You know whether or not your words and your actions match. You know whether or not you behave in a way that's in alignment with your values or your belief system for how you want your life to go. You know. And there's never going to be any hiding out from what you know, because you know. So when you think about things like your spiritual practices, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about connection to a higher vision for yourself. Religion could be included if you want it to be. When you're thinking about your spiritual practices, how you treat your loved ones, how you are in your romantic relationships, how you are with money, how you are with your health and wellness, how you are with your kids, how you are with your friendships. What do you tolerate in terms of your behavior? Either what do you tolerate that's coming your way, or what do you tolerate by simply really opting out of making a conscious choice? Because if you're making a conscious choice, like if you're really aware when you're sitting down for another Netflix haze, like, oh, this 2 hours of Netflix that I watch 7 days a week is 14 hours a week. 14 hours a week is a freaking part-time job. And that could like really get me far in the direction of something that I deeply want or something that'll make me happier. It's not that a Netflix haze is such a bad thing. Not trying to pick on Netflix here. It's not that the things that we do to decompress are bad. It's that when we do them without consciousness, then they can overrule our life. So if you really want to change your life, which is what this whole podcast has been about, this whole podcast episode, you got to know your patterns so that you know how you've been getting stuck. And you got to have some compassion and forgiveness for where you've been. And you got to be real about what you feel when you're frustrated or you're sad. And you got to be clear on your boundaries. And this is about raising your standards. Going, it isn't acceptable for me anymore to feel like I'm walking through life, meh. It isn't acceptable for me anymore to do all these things for other people and then I never do them for myself. Like, no, I'm done. It's not acceptable anymore for me to put a ton of sugar into my body. Okay? It's not acceptable for me anymore to throw stones at people who I think are not doing righteousness and justice correctly and then not check how I'm throwing that stone. It's not acceptable for me anymore to not look at my side of the street. It's not acceptable for me anymore to know that my elected officials are doing things that are wrong and I don't speak up about them. It's not acceptable for me anymore to devolve into an old stuck pattern that I'm aware doesn't do anything to help me live a better life. There's a really powerful declaration that you can make about your life right now, about what is no longer acceptable to you. And you got to be clear on what that is so that you can then enact a boundary. All right, this is kind of a long episode, but I'm pretty passionate about the topic. I feel like there's this observation that I have. I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in other people where when we're asking ourselves, what does it really take to change? We ask that question and we get lost in a haze of the things that feel like they're not within our control. It feels really real that thing that we are not sure we could do or achieve or have, it feels really real that it's out of reach. And sometimes it is. Like, don't get me wrong, okay? Like, I'm over it with the self-help that's just like, anything is achievable, da, 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 and it like completely ignores very real challenges that people have. All right, got it. I'm saying, in terms of your response to the challenges that you have in life, you get to choose those. And so when you're choosing those, are you aware of what you're choosing? Do you know your patterns? Are you aware? And are you proud of those patterns? Deep compassion. Are you having compassion for yourself as you're choosing? Are you forgiving yourself as you make mistakes as you're choosing? Are you being real about what you feel? Are you purging it in a way that is healthy for you to get it up and out rather than create more drama in your life? Because, I mean, when we attack other people to get our feelings out, it just creates more drama. Are we being clear? Are you being clear? Are you being conscious? Are you choosing your boundaries with others? And are you choosing your boundaries with yourself? And like I said, the best way I know to really know what my boundary is, the question that brings it all home for me is, if I do this, will I be proud of myself? Let me tell you, if I'd paused to ask that question a lot more 10 years ago, a lot nicer tech support requests going out, maybe a couple friendships that wouldn't have crashed and burned, definitely a lot less scar tissue with my husband, probably a lot faster progress in my business at various points. I mean, oh my goodness, the benefits of that consciousness and asking myself, hey, hold on, before you say that, before you do that, before you hit press send, are you going to be proud of yourself? Big question to ask. So here we are, all right? Lots of stuff to think about around what does it really take to change. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of this. If you want to head over to the private Facebook Courage Habit group, that's mostly how I'm talking with people these days about this stuff. I would so appreciate it if you'd write a little iTunes review. Helps more people to see the podcast, and I'm kind of wanting some of these ideas about making a better world and better lives to get out there. And the 5 minutes that you take to put a little podcast hello out there can help that to happen. Thanks for sticking in for this extra long episode of the Your Courageous Life podcast, and can't wait to talk to you next time.